Imagine walking into an old corner deli in 1965, the bell above the door jingling as the smell of fresh bread, tangy pickles, and sizzling bacon filled the air. Back then, sandwiches weren't just food, they were statements, experiments, even cultural snapshots. Some became timeless classics, while others faded into history, leaving behind only memories whispered by grandparents or tucked into yellowing recipe cards. In this journey, we'll unwrap 25 sandwiches that once held a proud place on menus, lunchboxes, and family tables, but slowly slipped into obscurity. From quirky regional inventions to short-lived fast food experiments, these forgotten creations tell stories of community, taste, and the way we used to live. Each one is a bite of history, rich with flavor, nostalgia, and maybe even a little laughter. The Bologna Stack. Picture this. You're sitting in a noisy school cafeteria in the late 1960s or 70s, the smell of floor wax mixed with the faint tang of chocolate milk cartons in the air. You pop open your metal lunchbox. Maybe it's decorated with Scooby-Doo, Star Wars, or Charlie's Angels. And there it is, the unmistakable, shining star of so many childhood lunches, the Bologna sandwich. It was simple, almost humble. 2 slices of soft, pillowy Wonder Bread that stuck to the roof of your mouth if you weren't careful, slathered with just a swipe of mustard, or sometimes mayo if your mom felt fancy. And then that thick, pink circle of bologna cut perfectly to fit the bread. Some kids got theirs fried the night before, giving it that smoky, curled edge flavor that lingered even when cold. Others just had the plain slice, straight from the Oscar Mayer pack, squeaky to the bite, salty enough to make you instantly reach for your thermos of milk. Back then, a pack of bologna cost less than $1, which meant it fed whole families without stretching the grocery budget too thin. Sure, by the 1980s it started to lose its shine as healthy lunches took over. But for so many of us, peeling back that wax paper and smelling that smoky slice was a sign of love, packed carefully between 2 slices of white bread. PB and banana Elvis style. Now, if you were lucky, every once in a while your lunchbox didn't just hold an ordinary sandwich. It held a little bit of rock and roll history. The peanut butter and banana sandwich, famously loved by Elvis Presley himself, was the kind of indulgence that made you feel like you were eating something almost forbidden. Open it up, and the first thing you'd notice was the sweet, mellow scent of ripe bananas mixing with the nutty, roasted smell of creamy peanut butter. If your mom, or maybe grandma, decided to heat it on the griddle, the bread would come out warm and golden, with the peanut butter just starting to melt into gooey rivers that glued your fingers together. Some adventurous families even added crispy bacon, giving each bite a smoky crunch that made your taste buds dance. Back in the 1950s and 60s, peanut butter was cheap protein, and bananas were an everyday grocery staple. But combined, they became something magical. It wasn't just lunch, it was a small, sticky reminder that food could be fun. Kids would giggle as the banana slices slid around, or as the peanut butter stretched in long strings when you pulled the sandwich apart. And even though nutrition experts eventually frowned on its sugary, calorie-heavy reputation, for a whole generation, biting into a PB and banana sandwich was pure joy. Messy, comforting, and just a little rebellious. Just like the king himself. Deviled ham spread. If you grew up in the mid-20th century, chances are you remember seeing that little red Underwood can sitting in the pantry. The paper label had a tiny devil mascot grinning at you, daring you to try what was inside. And when the lid popped open with that metallic snap, you knew exactly what you were in for. The strong, tangy scent of deviled ham. Spread thick on soft white bread, or sometimes crackers if you were snacking, it wasn't shy about announcing itself. The mixture was salty, peppery, with just enough vinegar bite to make your tongue tingle. A hint of clove and mustard gave it an almost spicy warmth, making it taste grown up in a way peanut butter and jelly never could. Some kids wrinkled their noses, but adults nodded knowingly, maybe slipping a slice of lettuce in there to balance out the richness. Underwood first introduced its deviled ham in the late 1800s, and by the 1930s, it had earned its place in countless American lunchboxes. In fact, it's considered the oldest continuously produced packaged food brand in the U.S. And while it was affordable, perfect for stretching the family budget, it also carried a sense of novelty. For many, opening that lunchbox to find deviled ham meant you weren't just eating another sandwich. You were part of a tradition, one that carried a little kick and a whole lot of character between two slices of bread. Now here's a sandwich that carried with it the unmistakable stamp of old-world flavor: the cheese and pickle sandwich. For many American kids, this was an introduction to British taste, smuggled into lunchboxes by parents or grandparents who grew up overseas. At first bite, it could be a shock. The sharp tang of Branston pickle mingling with the nutty richness of cheddar. But once you got past that first zing, oh, it became something truly unforgettable. The bread was usually sturdy white or brown, thick enough to hold back the juices from those chopped pickles in their vinegary sauce. Sometimes you'd unwrap it at school and catch that strong, almost punchy aroma. Sweet, sour, savory all at once. Other kids might crinkle their noses, but those who tried it often discovered it had a balance you just couldn't find in a plain ham or turkey sandwich. Branston pickle itself had been around since the 1920s in England, imported to the U.S. in specialty shops by mid-century. By the 1960s and 70s, immigrant families and adventurous eaters were sneaking it into everyday meals. Pairing it with cheddar turned a humble sandwich into something robust, tangy, and deeply satisfying. It wasn't the flashiest lunchbox choice, but for anyone who grew up with it, the cheese and pickle sandwich was like a ticket home. An echo of kitchen tables crowded with teapots, laughter, and the comforting smell of bread and cheese. Chopped olive delight. Walk into a small-town Midwestern deli in the 1950s, and you might have spotted a curious spread on rye bread that sparkled with little green jewels: the chopped olive sandwich. It wasn't flashy, but it sure was memorable. A mix of green olives, mayonnaise, and often a little chopped celery or pimento, this sandwich packed a salty punch that could wake up even the sleepiest lunch hour. The first bite hit you with that briny, almost tangy flavor, the kind that made your mouth water instantly. Then came the crunch of celery, adding a snap against the soft chew of rye or wheat bread. It was the kind of sandwich that made you sit up straighter at the table, because it wasn't just food, it was boldness between two slices. In many towns, delis proudly offered it as a specialty, while homemakers tucked it into picnic baskets for family outings. Olive spreads were even featured in mid-century church cookbooks, often listed right beside egg salad and ham salad, as if daring you to give them a chance. Sure, it wasn't a kid's favorite, too strong, too grown up. But for adults, especially those who loved salty, briny flavors, this was a sandwich to savor. And today, just the thought of it brings back the clatter of deli counters, the hum of soda fountains, and a time when bold tastes stood out. The Dagwood Tower. If there was ever a sandwich that shouted, "More is better," it was the Dagwood. Inspired by the Blondie comic strip character Dagwood Bumstead, who was always piling his sandwiches higher and higher, this creation became a cultural icon by the 1940s. Diners across America leaned into the joke, serving sandwiches stacked so tall you needed two hands, and sometimes a little courage to tackle them. Imagine the sound of plates clattering in a bustling diner, a waitress sliding over a sandwich so enormous it wobbled like a tower about to tip. Layer after layer, ham, turkey, salami, cheese, lettuce, tomato, onion, maybe even a fried egg, held together only by a heroic toothpick stabbed right through the middle. Some versions were so big you had to take them apart just to figure out where to start. It wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. Kids would gasp, adults would laugh, and friends dared each other to finish the whole thing. For the price of a regular meal, often just $1 or $2 in the 1950s, you got something that felt like a challenge, an event on a plate. And while giant sandwiches might not be practical today, the Dagwood captured the playful spirit of diners in their heyday, food that wasn't just eaten, but celebrated. Hot roast beef dip. Now, if you've ever stepped into a cozy diner on a chilly afternoon, you might remember the sight and smell of a steaming hot roast beef dip sandwich making its way to the table. Long before the French dip became a national chain staple, local diners were already perfecting this savory classic. Thick slices of slow-roasted beef were piled high on crusty bread, often a hoagie or French roll, and served with a little cup of rich, beefy au jus on the side. The ritual was half the fun. You'd pick up that warm, heavy sandwich, dip it into the steaming broth, and watch as the bread soaked up the juices without falling apart, if you were lucky. Then came that first bite, tender beef mingling with the salty, savory essence of the dip, juices running down your fingers as you reached for an extra napkin. The sound of slurping, sighing, and satisfied laughter often filled those booths. In the 1950s and 60s, you could order one of these beauties for under $1, often with a side of fries or coleslaw. For many working folks, it was hearty fuel. For kids tagging along, it was a messy, unforgettable treat. The hot roast beef dip wasn't just lunch. It was warmth in bread form, the kind of meal that made even the coldest day feel like home again. Egg and olive salad. There was something instantly recognizable about opening a diner menu in the 1950s or 60s and spotting the humble egg and olive salad sandwich. At first glance, it looked a lot like its cousin, the classic egg salad. But one bite told you this was a whole different story. The creaminess of hard-boiled eggs, mashed with mayo, got a sharp, salty surprise from chopped green olives scattered throughout. The smell alone told you what you were in for, that unmistakable briny aroma of olives mingling with the rich, slightly sulfurous scent of boiled eggs. Some people wrinkled their noses, while others smiled wide, because if you loved it, you really loved it. Spread thick on rye, wheat, or even plain white bread, it had both comfort and bite in every mouthful. This sandwich showed up often in church cookbooks and family recipe boxes, particularly in the Midwest and South. It was inexpensive to make. Eggs and a jar of olives could stretch into lunches for several days, and it added a little flair to the ordinary. It wasn't a kid's favorite, but for grown-ups, it was a taste of something bright and tangy in a world of more predictable lunch fare. And if you ever had one at a Formica diner counter with the clink of coffee cups nearby, chances are that memory has stayed with you. McDLT, hot side, cool side. If you grew up in the 1980s, you probably remember the excitement of unwrapping a McDonald's McDLT. It wasn't just a burger, it was an experience. The box alone made it different. A large, split styrofoam container with two separate compartments. On one side, the hot burger patty and bun. On the other, the crisp lettuce, juicy tomato, pickles, and cheese. The slogan said it all. The hot side stays hot, and the cool side stays cool. There was a small thrill in snapping open that container at the table, like you were opening some kind of futuristic lunch kit. You got to assemble the sandwich yourself, sliding the cool toppings onto the steaming patty just before that first bite. The textures were spot on. Warm, juicy beef against the crunch of chilled lettuce and the burst of fresh tomato. The McDLT launched in 1984 and quickly gained fans who loved the novelty and the fresher taste it promised. At around $1.60, it felt like a premium upgrade from the standard burger. But by the early 1990s, concerns about styrofoam packaging and rising costs doomed it to the history books. Still, for anyone who tasted one, the memory of that clever two-part box and the anticipation of building your own burger never really left. Wendy's Super Bar Subs. If you ever walked into a Wendy's during the late 1980s or early 90s, you probably remember the magic words, the Super Bar. For kids, it wasn't just lunch, it was an adventure. The Super Bar had 3 stations, Mexican, Italian, and salad. And tucked into that mix was the chance to build your very own sub-style sandwich. Picture it. Trays lined with cold cuts, shredded lettuce, sliced cheese, and every condiment you could imagine. The air was a jumble of smells, spicy taco meat from the Mexican section mixing with the tang of Italian pasta sauce, all under the hum of heat lamps. Kids darted back and forth with plates stacked high, parents shaking their heads as deli slices piled taller than the buns could handle. The best part? Freedom! For the price of about $2.99, you could eat like a king, or at least like a very inventive 10-year-old. You could pile ham, turkey, salami, or just make a mountain of pickles and cheese if that's what your heart wanted. It was messy, chaotic, and glorious. The Super Bar was eventually discontinued in the late 90s. Too much waste, too much upkeep. But for those who grew up in that golden window, Wendy's wasn't just a fast food stop. It was a playground for your appetite, and the subs you built there were uniquely your own. Burger King Yumbo. Before chicken sandwiches and Whoppers ruled the day, Burger King had a curious little item on the menu called the Yumbo. First introduced in 1968, it was nothing more than a hot ham and cheese sandwich. But for a while, it had a cult following. The Yumbo came wrapped in paper that trapped a puff of steam, and when you opened it, that unmistakable aroma of salty ham and melty American cheese came rushing out. The bun was soft, sometimes a little squished from the heat, and the cheese clung to the slices of ham in gooey layers. It wasn't fancy, it was cafeteria comfort food, reimagined for the fast food counter. For kids, it felt familiar, like something you might have eaten at school or at home after church on Sunday. For adults, it was cheap, quick, and just hearty enough to fill you up on a busy day. But like so many quirky fast food items, the Yumbo disappeared quietly in the mid-70s, only to reappear briefly in 2014 for a nostalgia-fueled comeback tour. Still, even in its short runs, the Yumbo proved that sometimes the simplest things, a little ham, a little cheese, a warm bun, can leave the biggest memories. Arby's Beef and Cheddar Classic. Few fast food sandwiches captured the spirit of the 1970s and 80s quite like Arby's original Beef and Cheddar Classic. At first glance, it was simple. Tender roast beef piled on a soft onion roll, topped with that unmistakable layer of warm, gooey cheddar sauce. But one bite told you this was no ordinary roast beef sandwich. The smell alone was unforgettable. Roast beef steaming as you unwrapped the shiny foil, with the tang of cheddar sauce mingling with the sweet scent of the onion roll. The sauce wasn't your average melted cheese. It had a sharp, tangy kick that gave every bite a rich, indulgent flavor. And if you were lucky, the sandwich would drip just enough onto the wrapper that you had to chase every last bite with your fingertips. Back then, the sandwich felt almost premium, with Arby's marketing itself as a slightly fancier alternative to burgers. For around $1.50 in the early 80s, you could enjoy something warm, cheesy, and filling, a meal that felt both familiar and just a little indulgent. Over the years, the recipe shifted, and while the beef and cheddar is still on menus today, fans of the original will tell you it was creamier, tangier, and softer back then. For many, biting into one wasn't just lunch. It was comfort wrapped in foil, the taste of a special treat that lingered long after. Pimento cheese sandwich. In the American South, there was one spread that held a place of honor at nearly every picnic, church social, and family gathering: pimento cheese. Bright orange, creamy, and speckled with little red bits of sweet pimento peppers, it wasn't just a sandwich filling, it was a symbol of Southern hospitality. Picture it on a hot summer afternoon, cicadas humming outside, while a table inside was lined with pitchers of sweet tea and plates of finger foods. On a plate sat soft white bread, edges trimmed neatly, stuffed with that unmistakable mixture of sharp cheddar, mayonnaise, and pimentos. The first bite was smooth and tangy, with the peppers adding a subtle sweetness that cut through the richness of the cheese. It was comfort food in its purest form. Pimento cheese had been around since the early 1900s, but by the 1950s it was a full-blown tradition, sold in jars in grocery stores and passed down through handwritten recipes. A jar cost less than $1 and could stretch into sandwiches for the whole family. And while it was a staple at the Masters Golf Tournament in Augusta, where fans still line up for $1.50 pimento cheese sandwiches, its true magic was in the way it made people gather. One bite could instantly remind you of porches, laughter, and the slow, sweet rhythm of Southern living. Fluffernutter. If you grew up in New England, chances are you've got a sweet, sticky memory of the Fluffernutter. It was the kind of sandwich that made parents sigh and kids cheer. Just 2 slices of soft white bread, a layer of creamy peanut butter, and then the star of the show, marshmallow fluff. The moment you peeled apart the sandwich, those gooey white strands would stretch like taffy, clinging to your fingers and sometimes even your face. The smell was unmistakable too. Roasted peanuts mixing with that pure sugary sweetness like a candy shop tucked into your lunchbox. It wasn't neat, it wasn't fancy, but oh, was it fun! Marshmallow fluff itself was invented in Massachusetts back in 1917, and by the 1960s and 70s, the Fluffernutter had become a regional icon. Kids would beg for it in their lunch bags, while parents debated whether it was really food or just dessert disguised as a sandwich. In fact, the Fluffernutter became such a beloved symbol of New England that in 2006, Massachusetts even tried to make it the official state sandwich. Sure, nutrition experts wagged their fingers, but when you were a kid, biting into that soft, sugary cloud felt like pure joy. The Fluffernutter wasn't about balance or health, it was about childhood, indulgence, and that delicious moment when the world was sweet and simple. Cucumber tea sandwich. There's a certain elegance in simplicity, and nowhere was that more evident than in the cucumber tea sandwich. Thinly sliced cucumbers laid gently on buttered white bread may not sound like much, but for decades it was the very picture of refinement at bridal showers, garden parties, and afternoon teas. The first thing you noticed wasn't the flavor, but the feeling. The bread was soft and delicate, crusts neatly trimmed away, while the cool cucumbers gave off a fresh, crisp scent, like walking through a garden after a summer rain. Each bite was light and refreshing, the buttery richness blending with the watery crunch of cucumber in a way that felt soothing rather than heavy. This tradition had roots in Victorian England, but by the early 20th century it had made its way across the Atlantic, embraced by American hostesses who wanted to add a touch of class to their gatherings. In the 1950s and 60s, these sandwiches appeared on polished trays alongside petite fours and porcelain teacups, symbols of civility and care. It may not have been the kind of sandwich to fuel a hard day's work, but that was never the point. The cucumber tea sandwich was about moments, pauses in the day, where people gathered, chatted, and savored something delicate. A bite of calm in a noisy world. Chow mein sandwich. Few regional sandwiches were as quirky or as unforgettable as the chow mein sandwich, a true New England oddity. Picture a hamburger bun, but instead of beef or ham, it's overflowing with crispy chow mein noodles smothered in a thick, savory brown gravy. A little messy? Absolutely. But for the folks who grew up on it, that crunch-meat-sauce combination was pure comfort. The smell alone told you what you were in for. The soy sauce-rich aroma of Chinese-American chow mein filling the air of a small-town diner, mingling with the ever-present scent of French fries and coffee. When you bit into it, the bun gave way to a symphony of textures. The crunch of fried noodles softened by warm gravy, with bits of onion and celery adding extra snap. The chow mein sandwich first appeared in the 1920s in Fall River, Massachusetts, where a large Portuguese and Chinese immigrant population helped shape local food culture. By the 1950s, it was a beloved staple at diners, carnivals, and takeout joints across southeastern New England. And the best part? It was cheap. For just a few cents, you had a sandwich that filled you up and gave you something entirely different from the usual ham and cheese. It never really spread beyond its home turf, but for those who remember it, the chow mein sandwich was more than a meal. It was small-town flavor, wrapped in nostalgia and a little bit of gravy. Meatloaf sandwich. Few things said leftovers done right like the meatloaf sandwich. After Sunday dinner, when the oven had filled the house with the smell of onions, ketchup glaze, and seasoned beef, families knew what came next. Slices of cold meatloaf tucked between bread for tomorrow's lunch. The texture was distinct, dense yet tender, with flecks of onion and breadcrumbs holding it all together. Some people preferred theirs with just ketchup, that familiar tang soaking slightly into the bread. Others went bold with mustard, mayonnaise, or even a slice of cheese. Either way, when you took that first bite, you got the savory comfort of last night's dinner, now portable enough for a lunchbox or wrapped in wax paper for work. During the 1950s and 60s, meatloaf itself was a thrifty hero, stretching ground beef with fillers to feed big families without breaking the budget. Leftovers weren't just practical, they were expected. A single loaf could carry a family through several meals, and the sandwich was the most beloved form of reinvention. Sure, it wasn't glamorous, but that was the point. The meatloaf sandwich represented resourcefulness, love, and the kind of home-style cooking that made you feel cared for. Cold or warm, plain or dressed up, it was proof that comfort could be found between two simple slices of bread. Fried bologna and egg. There was nothing quite like waking up to the sound of a skillet sizzling and the smell of fried bologna and egg wafting through the kitchen. It was the kind of breakfast or quick lunch that made you feel rich, even when the ingredients were as humble as they came. The trick was simple. Toss a slice of bologna into a hot pan and watch as the edges curl up like little cups. The sizzling gave off that smoky, salty aroma that filled the whole room. Then came the egg, fried until the yolk was just set, or left a little runny if you were lucky. Slip them between two slices of bread, maybe with a swipe of mustard or a slice of cheese, and suddenly you had a sandwich that tasted like pure comfort. In the 1950s and 60s, bologna was known as poor man's steak. A whole pack cost less than $1 and could feed the whole family. Pairing it with an egg turned it into a hearty, protein-packed meal that felt both thrifty and indulgent at the same time. For many kids, this sandwich was a Saturday morning treat, eaten at the kitchen table with cartoons playing in the background. It was messy, it was salty, it was smoky, and it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest foods carry the richest memories. Salmon salad. Before tuna salad ruled the lunchbox, there was the humble salmon salad sandwich. Made from canned salmon, bright pink and a little flaky, it was the thrifty cousin of its more famous counterpart. Families who grew up in the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 60s remember it well. A can of salmon emptied into a bowl, bones and all, mashed together with mayonnaise, chopped celery, and maybe a squeeze of lemon if you had it. The smell was unmistakable, a briny, ocean-like aroma that carried through the kitchen. Once spread on soft bread, the texture was both creamy and slightly chunky, with tiny crunches of celery breaking up the richness. Some families added hard-boiled egg for extra heft. Others preferred a little pickle relish for tang. Canned salmon was a Depression-era staple, sold cheaply in grocery stores and designed to stretch into multiple meals. A single can might cost just a few dimes and could feed a whole family once transformed into sandwiches. Packed into wax paper for school lunches or served at home with a side of chips, salmon salad was dependable, filling, and just different enough from tuna to stand out. For many, it carried the taste of home economics classes, church picnics, and frugal kitchens that knew how to turn the simplest ingredients into lasting comfort. Cheese dreams. If you've ever spent a rainy afternoon stuck indoors in the 1950s or 60s, there's a good chance you remember the warm comfort of cheese dreams. This open-faced sandwich was as simple as it was satisfying. A slice of bread, a generous layer of cheese, often sharp cheddar or American, and whatever topping was on hand, like a slice of tomato or a strip of bacon. Then it was slid under the broiler until the cheese bubbled, browned, and filled the whole kitchen with that irresistible aroma of melted dairy magic. The first bite was always a little risky. You had to blow on it just enough to avoid burning your tongue. The bread stayed soft underneath, but the edges crisped up, giving you that crunch meets gooey texture that made every bite feel indulgent. The tomato added a juicy tang, the bacon a salty snap, and together they transformed a humble piece of bread into something that felt like a treat. In the era before microwaves, the broiler was the workhorse of quick family meals, and cheese dreams became a favorite not only for kids, but also for harried parents who needed to stretch a block of cheese into dinner. Cheap, fast, and endlessly adaptable, they were proof that comfort didn't need to be complicated. For many, cheese dreams were less about recipes and more about moments. Rainy afternoons, glowing ovens, and the smell of bubbling cheese that promised everything would be all right. Finger sandwich platters. There was a time when no wedding, funeral, or church reception was complete with a towering tray of finger sandwiches. Neatly trimmed, crustless squares and triangles lined up in perfect rows, each one a little bite-sized gift waiting to be discovered. These weren't meant to fill you up, they were meant to bring people together. The sight was always elegant, white bread layered with ham salad, chicken salad, or cucumber, the pastel colors of the fillings peeking out like ribbons in a patchwork quilt. Sometimes they were topped with a sprig of parsley, or toothpicks with frilly plastic ends that caught the light as trays were passed from hand to hand. The smell was a mix of mayonnaise, fresh bread, and a hint of pickle brine drifting through the hall. By the 1950s, finger sandwiches had become a staple of community gatherings. They were inexpensive, easy to prepare in large quantities, and polite to eat. No dripping sauces or towering stacks, just delicate bites to keep conversations flowing. A whole tray could be made from just a loaf or two of bread and a few pantry staples, stretching budgets while still feeling generous. For many, they carried quiet comfort. Whether at a celebration or a somber farewell, those little sandwiches represented care, proof that someone had taken the time to cut, spread, and share. Sloppy Joe's cousin. Long before canned manwich made things uniform, every household had its own take on the Sloppy Joe. Some called it loose meat, others just barbecue sandwiches. But whatever the name, it was a staple of potlucks, weeknight dinners, and church socials. And depending on whose kitchen you were standing in, you never quite knew what you were going to get. The skillet would sizzle with ground beef as onions softened and filled the house with their sweet aroma. Then came the sauce, sometimes tomato paste with a dash of brown sugar, sometimes ketchup and mustard, sometimes even a splash of Worcestershire. Some families leaned spicy, tossing in chili powder, while others kept it sweet and tangy. Once spooned onto soft hamburger buns, the mixture became gloriously messy, dripping down your hands faster than you could keep up. By the 1950s and 60s, these sandwiches were everywhere. They were cheap, filling, and crowd-friendly. A single pound of beef could feed half a dozen kids if you bulked it out with sauce and a few extra onions. At church potlucks, you could walk down a line of crock pots and taste 10 different versions, each one claiming to be the best. The Sloppy Joe's cousin wasn't about perfection. It was about togetherness, about sharing a meal so messy it practically demanded laughter around the table. Ham salad sandwich. If there was one way to make the most of holiday leftovers, it was the ham salad sandwich. After Easter or Christmas, when a big glazed ham had been carved down to scraps, thrifty families knew just what to do. Grind or chop the remaining bits, stir in mayonnaise, pickle relish, and sometimes a touch of mustard, and spread the rosy pink mixture thick between slices of bread. The smell was sharp yet inviting, a mix of sweet pickle brine, salty ham, and creamy mayo that hinted at both celebration and economy. The texture was chunky and smooth all at once, with little bursts of tangy relish hiding in every bite. Some people even like to add hard-boiled eggs for extra richness, while others swore by a dash of paprika to brighten the flavor. Ham salad sandwiches often showed up at family parties, church gatherings, and even baby showers. They were inexpensive to prepare in bulk, yet they always felt festive, a reminder of the feast that had come before. Platters of them, cut into neat triangles, would disappear quickly as guests reached for seconds. For kids, it wasn't always love at first bite. The flavor could be strong. But for adults, it was nostalgia itself. Ham salad tasted like resourcefulness, like family kitchens where nothing went to waste, and like the lingering joy of holidays stretching just a little longer. Shrimp salad roll. Before lobster rolls became the darling of seaside menus, there was the more humble shrimp salad roll. Found in diners, beachside shacks, and family cookouts along the East Coast, it was cool, creamy, and every bite tasted like summer. The sandwich usually started with a soft split-top hot dog bun, lightly buttered and toasted on the outside so it had a golden crunch. Inside, it was packed with a creamy mixture of shrimp, mayonnaise, diced celery, and sometimes a hint of dill or Old Bay seasoning. The smell was fresh and briny, with just enough herbiness to make your mouth water. Bite into it, and you'd get that contrast of buttery bread, crunchy celery, and tender shrimp that melted into the creamy dressing. In the 1950s and 60s, shrimp salad rolls were considered a treat, but not out of reach. Shrimp was cheaper then, and coastal towns often celebrated it with festivals and roadside stands. Families would order a tray full to share, the sandwiches wrapped in wax paper that stuck a little to the mayo, leaving your fingers deliciously messy. What made them special wasn't just the flavor, it was the setting. Eating a shrimp salad roll with the salty ocean breeze in your hair, the sound of gulls overhead, and sand sticking to your feet made the simple sandwich feel like a luxury vacation on a bun. Party sandwich loaf. If there was ever a sandwich designed to make guests stop in their tracks, it was the party sandwich loaf. This mid-century showstopper looked like dessert, but surprised everyone with savory layers inside. Imagine a whole loaf of bread sliced horizontally, with each layer spread with something different: chicken salad, egg salad, ham salad, even tuna. Once stacked, the entire cake was frosted in whipped cream cheese or sometimes mayonnaise, then decorated with olives, parsley, or sliced vegetables. The sight alone was unforgettable. At first glance, it looked like a frosted layer cake sitting proudly in the center of a party table. But once someone cut into it, revealing pastel-colored stripes of salad fillings, you could hear the chuckles and gasps around the room. It was playful, it was quirky, and it was pure 1950s hospitality. The taste, a mix of creamy, tangy, and hearty, depending on which slice you got. One bite might be rich with ham salad, the next cooling with cucumber or egg. It was unpredictable in the best way. These sandwich loaves often appeared at bridal showers, church luncheons, and holiday gatherings. They weren't practical for everyday eating, but they weren't meant to be. They were edible centerpieces, the kind of food that brought people together to laugh, share, and remember. For many, the party sandwich loaf is the ultimate retro memory. A little odd, a little over the top, and completely unforgettable. And there we have it, 25 sandwiches that once filled our lunchboxes, dinner tables, diners, and party trays. Some were humble, like a slice of bologna tucked between two pieces of white bread. Others were extravagant, like the party sandwich loaf that looked more like dessert than lunch. But each one carried something more important than just flavor. They carried memories. Think back to the first time you opened a lunchbox and smelled the smoky tang of bologna, or the sticky sweetness of a fluffernutter stretching between the bread. Maybe you remember sitting at a diner counter, watching the waitress set down a hot roast beef dip with steam rising into the air. Or maybe it was standing at a backyard picnic, holding a paper plate as someone handed you a ham salad sandwich cut neatly into triangles. These sandwiches weren't about food trends or health charts. They were about love, thrift, creativity, and the joy of making something from what you had. They were the taste of Saturday mornings, of after-church luncheons, of parties where laughter echoed louder than the clinking of glasses. Even the quirky ones, the chow mein sandwich or the McDLT, remind us that food has always been playful, a place for experimentation and fun. And while many of these sandwiches have faded from menus, they haven't disappeared from our hearts. They're still tucked away in memory, ready to be brought back in conversation, in an old recipe card, or maybe even in your own kitchen, if you're brave enough to try. Because, in the end, a sandwich isn't just bread and filling. It's a story of who we were, where we gathered, and the little things that made life rich. And maybe, just maybe, it's time a few of these long-lost sandwiches made their comeback.